Hi guys, it's Matt here from MCS-books, and today I'm going to be doing the first part of the discussion videos that will be about The Secrets of Jin-Shei by Alma Alexander. And if you aren't aware, I am currently doing a read-along under the hashtag MCS-readalong, in which a whole group of us are reading The Secrets of Jin-Shei, and over 3 weeks we're going to be doing live chats on Twitter, and I'm going to be doing 3 discussion videos in regards to the book, in which I sort of deconstruct certain elements and analyze them, but also pose questions for you guys to answer and to think about when you're reading the text, in the hopes that we get some really interesting talks and ideas down in the comment section below. So in this video, I'm only going to be talking about the first 139 pages of the book. Now that is approximately 2 parts, and there's around 10 chapters in each part. And this ultimately opens up the entire book. You can imagine it as the first act of a 3-act play. And yes, I'm going to be talking about it today with all my notes that I've been taking while I've been reading down here. So I've been using my, I say it's my red journal, but it's more burgundy. But I've been using my journal. So that's going to be down on the table in front of me, and I'm going to be pulling quotes from the book, so if you ever see me looking down, that will be why. Now, if you haven't quite yet read all 139 pages so far, that's absolutely fine. The first half of this video I'm going to keep spoiler-free, and I'm just going to ask some basic questions and provoke some basic thoughts that you can use when you read that first 139 pages. If you have read these parts, excellent, you can watch the entire video. The second part will include spoilers, and I will mention when I'm about to go into the spoilery section, so if you haven't read them all yet, you can leave the video at that point, but if you have, please stay and listen and comment all your thoughts down below. Now, for the purpose of this video, I'm going to be discussing a few themes in particular. The first one will actually be about the title of the book, The Secrets of Jin-Shei, in which I kind of discuss and question what does Jin-Shei actually mean. The second point will be world building. This book itself is actually a fantasy book and requires a lot of world building, which we get mostly in this first part. So I'm going to sort of analyse the need for the world building and how Alma Alexander executes the world building. Then we're going to look at the relationships within this text, with a specific look at sisterhood and motherhood, and how these female relationships shape the book itself and affect the characters. Then after that, I'm going to be going into the spoiler section, in which I'm going to look at the characters themselves, give brief descriptions about what we learn about these characters in this part, and what we think the characters will be doing later on in the book. And in the final section, we're going to look at the depth of womanhood, and that's going to tie in with the characters, in which we get a sense of what it means to be a woman in this world of this book, and how the different characters portray this. So before we get into this, I do want to mention the live chat on Twitter. It's going to happen on Wednesday between 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock in the evening, so 8 and 9 p.m. British summertime. So you might have to figure out what time that is in your time zone. But yeah, I'm just going to be using the hashtag MCS-readalong, and if you want to join in, definitely feel free. Last week there was a football, so it wasn't as busy, but Alma Alexander, the author, is available when she can be, as she's more than happy to answer any questions you might have about the book. So let's begin. I do also want to talk about the prologue, actually, and I just want to quickly mention that if you have read the prologue, I really urge you to read the prologue again once you've finished the book. For me, when I went back to the book and started with that little prologue, it's just 1 page, and it's written out like a letter almost, by one of the main characters. And for me, it was like being greeted by an old friend, and it got quite emotional because it definitely sets up the tone of the story, and it definitely tells you, and it doesn't spoil anything, but it definitely tells you the direction that the book is going to take. And it gives you a definite taste for everything that's going to happen within this book. And when you know what has happened, it takes on a whole different meaning, and for me, it was just very special. So I do definitely urge you to read that prologue again once you have finished the book. It does have a completely different feel when you know what's going to happen. So now let's get to the first topic, and that is the topic of Jin-Shei. What is Jin-Shei? So you find out quite early on in this book that Jin-Shei is a vow of sisterhood. Now, in the world of this book, it is inspired by an old historic Chinese culture. Now, Jin-Shei is part of a woman's language which is called Jinishu. Now, Jinishu is inspired by the Nushu, which is a language that was created within China by women, and it was written and read only by women. Now, this was because women weren't allowed to otherwise read and write, particularly certain castes of women. You know, it wasn't considered a feminine activity, it wasn't considered something that they needed to do. So the women created this language themselves in which they could write and communicate with each other, especially across long distances or within their own family unit. And it definitely empowered them to give them some form of autonomy and to give them the sort of difference between their male counterparts and allowed them to express themselves in very specific ways. There are plenty of books like this, and another book that I have read which kind of deals with a similar topic, and particularly Nushu, is Snowflower and the Secret Fan, and that also deals with the topic of sisterhoods between women who aren't actually sisters. So it's really interesting to be in this world where we are reading about what's ultimately a woman's world. Of course, it exists in a world where men have their own language and stuff, but we're only seeing it from the point of view of JinShei and JinShu. So that is specifically a female perspective of the world that is at hand. And it's really interesting for us to kind of learn about the role of women within not only this world, but to see the counterparts of women within China historically. Now, JinShei itself, as I said, is a vow of sisterhood, but it's not one between blood sisters. It is a tie that bonds women together who are not otherwise related, and it is irrespective of any sort of class system or economic state that the character is in. It transcends all boundaries and is a gift that is passed down from mother to daughter, and then is shared with peers and other females of similar ages. That means that this bond, because it isn't blood-bound, it is a vow that is taken, and it gives it a heavier weight than that between blood sisters. It is one that can't be broken once it is said, and it kind of directs these women's lives together as it goes forwards. Now, I find that absolutely fascinating. It definitely brings up this notion of sort of choosing your family, and what does it mean to have a blood family and then the family that you choose, and how do we relate to other people, and particularly how do women relate to each other when they have this bond that can connect them so much more significantly than any other relationship in their life. Now, also, the title of the story is The Secrets of Jin-Shei, so that kind of gives us a sense of what's going to happen throughout the book. And I do want you to consider, when you're reading this book, what does Jin-Shei really mean? So when we learn about the first Jin-Shei bond that is made in this book, there is a quote that goes along with it on page 62, in which it says, "She wanted a sister and a companion, not a servant or a slave. She has enough attendants, she wants a friend." Now, that kind of sums up the meaning of it, and we learn that it kind of goes forward when the main character's mother says, "What will Jin-Shei give you, my daughter? What will it ask of you?" So when you are reading the book and you have this sense of what Jin-Shei is, I want you to consider further on the role that Jin-Shei plays in the story, and think of Jin-Shei almost as a character, similar to one of the Fates in sort of famous Greek mythology, and other stories that have come from that. If we think of Jin-Shei not only as a bond between the characters, but as a character itself, and one that is akin to fate, what can we imagine is going to happen to the characters and to the women that we meet? How do we think that kind of power drives the story constantly and is going towards the ultimate end? So like I said, this book is set in a fantasy world that is definitely inspired by a historic China, and so it requires a lot of exposition. Now, oftentimes books can be sort of bogged down by the exposition, especially when you're just being told what is happening and what the world is like. But in this book, Alexander manages to weave together a very rich culture within the world, without it ever feeling like we're just being talked at and being muddied by somebody else's idea that we aren't allowed to kind of imagine ourselves. We learn about the world, and we learn about different facets of the world through the characters as they journey through different parts of the world. We learn about the emperor's court and the court life with the intrigue and everything through Tai, the character, who is within this world and kind of navigating through it as somebody who is not actually a part of that world. So because we are not also a part of that world, that gives us the lens to kind of learn about it through those eyes, which is very wonderful. And then, of course, we have Nia in the temple, and we learn about the temple and the religion of this world, in which Nia's memories of her kind of almost growing up in the temple, we grow up with her and we grow our understanding of the temple and the way that religion in this world kind of plays out. And then we have Saffron, and from her perspective, we learn about the guard and the sort of quarters in which the guard live. And then we have Chian on the other side, who is again a part of this compound, yet we're learning two completely different perspectives, which gives us a sense of a greater understanding of the guard and the compound that the guard living within. Now, the writing style itself is so lyrical, it's so beautiful. It is fantasy, but it has a very literary feel to it, in which you are absolutely absorbed by the colours, the smells, the sounds that are around all the characters at all the times. It's a beautiful world that Alma has created, and it is written just as beautifully to match that. So it kind of makes it very enjoyable to get involved in it. Now, on Wednesday in the Twitter chat, I asked Alma about how much kind of research went into the book, and she says that she read a lot of books. She has a whole shelf in her library dedicated to what she read for the writing of The Secrets of Jin-Shei, and then she said that she had written it in 3 months. She was just in the zone and writing it, and she said that she almost lived in the world for that whole time, and you can absolutely tell that. I find that every time I dip in and out of this book, I am also living in the world, and every time I close the book, it kind of takes me a while to remove myself from that world, because it's still playing out in my head, and I can still feel it, I can still taste it, I can still see it around me. And it does give you a really interesting perspective on the sort of historic China that this is inspired from. I mean, of course, it's not going to be historically accurate because it is a fantasy book, but at the same time, there are senses and there are traces of this historic China, which is really interesting, particularly if you're used to reading sort of Western world fantasies that are set in sort of medieval Britain and Europe. World building for fantasy is highly important. You need to understand the world that your characters are moving around in. You need to understand the things that affect them. So when we learn about Jinshu and JinShei, that is part of the world building. It's part of the world that the characters are living within, and it's part of the world that we are living within. So we need to learn about it somehow, and the way that it is just fed to us in little bits and bobs through the way the characters do things, rather than the ways of just a character being very passive in the world happening to her, gives us a sense of being a part of this world, and gives it that much more stronger reality to attach it to something that is actually happening. So if the character is doing something, perhaps going to the temple and looking for the right niche to pray in front of, we can attach that religion or that practice to a character actually doing something, rather than it just happening to be there, but we don't ever get a chance to interact with it. And I find that really amazing when you get something that's so well written that you do feel like you can attach it to something physical. The way the world has been built up so far, it only kind of gives us like the tip of the iceberg, and it's going to get deeper as the story progresses. But as we become more familiar with it, we can really consider the way that the world itself also plays a role in the story, and how it's not just a pretty backdrop for the action that is happening. It is actually like woven in and out, and really shapes the way that the characters move. So I want you to always like kind of notice that the way that this world and this culture is delivering us the story throughout the book. So now let's talk about sisterhood and motherhood. I think I want to focus on motherhood in this part of the video, because of course sisterhood is going to be something that kind of remains throughout the entire story, and we'll get a little bit more depth in it. But it is interesting to always consider the relationship between women and between like the sisters, not only the sisters who have formed the Jin-Shei bond, but the sisters who are actually related to each other, particularly Antien and Liu Dan, the way that their blood sisterhood kind of also has a completely different dimension to the way that the Jin-Shei bond happens between the characters that we meet. So what I find really interesting about this first part is that whilst we're learning about Jin-Shei and this bond of sisterhood, all the characters are actually children, and most of them we get to see a glimpse of them with their mothers. Now, we have a vast array of different kinds of mothers in this book, which is really valuable. We have Rimshi, who is Tai's mother, who is very loving, very caring, deeply affectionate to her daughter. And on the other hand, we have Tian's mother, who is both absent yet present, and kind of varying between these two poles of apathy towards her daughter and sometimes loving her daughter. And yet still there is the significance that, you know, Jian has learnt Jin-Shei, so her mother has done that duty at least. And then you get characters whose mothers are absent, and what role that kind of plays within the story too. So when you're reading the book, I think it's really interesting to consider the relationship between the character and their mother. How do they learn to love each other? How do they learn to form these bonds between other women? And then how does that then affect the relationship that they have with the sisters that they bond with? Every single character has a completely different relationship, and I think that does in a way affect the way that they treat the other women in their lives. And I just think it's a really interesting thing to notice and to pay attention to. So now I'm going to move into a more spoilery part of the discussion. So if you haven't read those first 139 pages, perhaps now is a good time to kind of come out of the video and come back when you have read that whole first part. But if you have read them, then please stay and feel free to give me all of your thoughts down in the comment section below. So again, I want to continue looking briefly at the way that the mothers play an important role in the story of the kind of girls. Now we have some characters who don't have mothers, you know, like Chiffon and Yurt. She had an adopted mother, but also as she is an apprentice to Zevan, she has that relationship, which is in some way like a master and apprentice relationship, but is also, again, as they're both females, a sort of mother-daughter relationship. And when Ziwan dies, Yurt, you know, is the only one that's left in the will and has to kind of look after all the funeral plans to kind of send Ziwan off. So that is in itself is very interesting. It gives us a broader idea of what motherhood can actually mean. It doesn't have to be like a kind of usual idea of a mum and their daughter. It can stretch to other different forms of relationships. And then of course we have Chiffon, who doesn't have a mother at all, or she was left at the guard as a baby. She didn't even have a name, and she grows up always needing to find her place and to kind of give herself a sense of being a child of something or someone. And in this case, that is being a child of the guard, like as a big noun. What is interesting is that of all the women that we meet in this first part of the story, Chiffon is the only one who can't read or write in Jin-Shei. And then that is of course the sort of almost catalyst for Qian and Chiffon's relationship to kind of become sisters themselves. Now, when I mentioned earlier that Qian's mother is both there and not there, it's really interesting to think about how little we actually learn about Qian's mother and her relationship with her mother, and how that kind of relates with Chiffon not having a mother. Then you can kind of start to sort of piece the characters together. When you also have Nia and Kai Lin, both of them have mothers who care to some extent but are very different in their beliefs to their daughters. And then that kind of brings Kai Lin and Nia together. Even though they have completely different experiences with their mothers, there is similarities between them. And then Tai with her mother have a very close relationship, who first bonds with An Tian. Now An Tian, we don't really learn much, we don't have the time to kind of understand her relationship with her mother, but we can tell through the way that we learn about Liu Dan's relationship with her mother's history, but then also the Empress, who is An Tian's mother. That gives us a sense of what kind of could be like. There is of course going to be the love between the Empress and An Tian, because An Tian is the Empress's biological daughter, which kind of increases that bond. But then at the same time, there is going to be a sort of gap between them in the way that the court ceremony affects them, and that, you know, An Tian is going to be brought up by nursemaids and other people looking after her because the Empress has to be the Empress. So it's interesting to kind of consider where are the similarities between An Tian and Tai and their parents, and how does that kind of help them to bond, and how does that then shape their relationship, particularly when Tai takes on the bond with Liu Dan. So now that we've kind of got a brief glimpse of some of the characters and the relationship to parents, I wanted to look closer at the characters. I think, as it's one of these books that takes on multiple multiple points of view, it's really interesting because I think you do naturally kind of get drawn towards one point of view more, but what I really like is that every single character is so different, and they have such a strong identity within themselves, and therefore you kind of can see a very broad idea of what it means to be a woman in this world, and you get different senses of different kinds of women. On the one hand, you have Chiffon and Kai Lin, and both of them in some ways sort of reject their femininity and their feminine sides. Chiffon, doesn't want to get involved with like the gossip and the girly aspect of the sort of female guards. She wants to get involved with the male aspect where, she is just fighting and she is being strong at all times. Kai Lin, she doesn't really care anymore for the literature that's written in JinShei. She wants to learn Hachashu, which is the man's tongue. And then she's very passionate about this sort of scientific approach to understanding the world. And then you kind of have this idea of the sense of marriage making a woman. So you have Nia, who, with her crippled foot and her disfigurement, she knows that she's not going to ever get married. She knows that she's not going to be offered that sort of role. So she finds a different way to kind of portray her femininity. She's not graceful. She doesn't have this beauty that she believes a woman should have. So she kind of learns to create the beauty of her mind and to find faith and her femininity in her religion, and how sort of she kind of takes on this mothering role with the children of the temple, in which she kind of teaches them stories and everything. And that is also interesting to learn about Antien. She is the princess empress to be, and it's expected that she is going to, her role is to choose the emperor. She has to choose a husband to shape and marry and become the emperor of like the entire country. And then that obviously has an impact on who she is as a woman and how her sort of womanhood is defined by the emperor that she chooses. And she is probably the most privileged woman of the whole bunch that we meet, yet it's interesting to notice how that privilege also comes with a lot of encroaching on her freedoms. We also see this sense of marriage with Kai Lin, in which she has to marry, but she doesn't really want to, so she kind of treats it as a very almost as a business-like deal, in which she wants to choose a man who is going to give her the liberty to continue studying Hachashu and to continue reading books and have a library and everything. So again, she rejects that marriage as her way of kind of rejecting femininity, and she gives it something that is very utilitarian. And it's really interesting to see that those differences between how these women kind of express their femininity or not their femininity. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how, as the book progresses, the characters sort of either embrace or reject their femininity in other ways, especially as they get older. They've all, towards the end of these 139 pages, most of them have had their Shatwal ceremony in which they kind of move into womanhood. And I think that's going to be interesting to then track to see how, as they become now adults and women, how that then affects their sort of role, their gender role and their femininity or otherwise within the rest of the story, and how they kind of navigate that. So there is something that I find very interesting. Now there's a parallel between the way that Tai and Antien first meet and how Nia and Li Hui first meet. Antien is a very interesting character. When we first see her, she appears quite lofty, but then of course she becomes very important to the story, and then as she dies, that is almost the catalyst for the whole story happening, and that's like, and Antien's role and her death as a role really affects and shapes the way that the women who have bonded together continue their relationship and are constantly haunted by the ghost of Antien in their relationship. But I wouldn't say haunted is the right word, because it's a very positive force and it really does help to strengthen the bond. So it's interesting to notice how Tai and Antien's relationship first begins in a very similar vein to Nia and Li Hui's relationship. Both of them end with this sort of vague, we'll see each other again. It's a very brief meeting in which wasn't meant to happen, yet fate in some way kind of made it happen. And both Tai and Antien are very different social classes, and it's the same for Nia and Li Hui. So then for the characters with the most power to then end that conversation with we'll see each other again, what does that mean, and what's that going to represent in the way that their relationship grows from this part of the story into the next part of the story? So it's going to be really interesting to note the importance that Antien played. for the whole book, and whether there's going to be more parallels between Li Hui and the role that he plays in the rest of the book. So there's one more sort of imagery that we are made aware of within this first part of the book, and I want to kind of look at that imagery as a symbol and what that is going to represent throughout the rest of the book. Now, we have the yearwood, which is a little string in which they attach beads to represent days and weeks of their lives, and it's sort of just a way of tracking their lives. And it's part of like the sort of almost religious culture that everyone in this world practices in some way. And then you have the red journal that Tai uses from Antien, and in which she sort of documents everything, either in poetry or in diary entry. Now, both of these things are in some ways an account of a life that has been lived. They sort of trace the life from birth to eventual death, and it just, in some way, it is a way of documenting a life lived. And that kind of also ties in with a sort of a memory of life and a person behind the life. Now, the yearwood is almost identityless. It's just a way of counting the days lived, whereas the journal itself is very much a part of Tai, and it's going to represent, it's going to be a lot more personal, and a big part of her identity is going to be within that book. Now, what I find very fascinating is that in some respects, those sort of items are the same as this book, especially when you look at the prologue, the way that it sort of kind of says that, it sort of talks about, you know, it sort of gives like a summary of a life almost. Now this book, given its size, it's going to trace like an entire lifetime almost, and it is going to trace the bond of the sisterhood, so it's going to trace the life of this JinShei bond. So I find it absolutely fascinating that this sort of symbolism exists, and I want to kind of make you aware to it, to kind of consider the role that the yearwood and the journal itself plays within the rest of the story, and they are in a way a document, just like this book is, of the lives of these female characters that we are made aware of. So I think that's just going to be another interesting thing to keep track of whilst you're reading the rest of the parts, especially when we have a quote on page 92 where it says, but Antien was not the emperor, would never have a niche for herself where people would come and pray to her bright spirit. Tai would think of this, her eyes bright with tears she could not seem to shed, as she sat beside the ivory emperor's shrine and watched the cascades of white morning candles fighting for space with incense holders, for sticks saturated with frankincense or lilac essence, with piles of peaches symbolizing immortality, with mounds of rice and of tamarind seeds. The ivory emperor would become a lesser god. Antien would remain a fading memory. So again, it plays in that idea of memory and the role that memory is going to play throughout this book, and how we can sort of trace with that prologue the book as a memory itself, and the way that memory then plays out and it becomes almost a character of the story. So for those of you who have read these first 139 pages, I have some questions which I want you to think about and to open up discussion down in the comments. So one of the first ones is, who is your favourite character so far and why? For me, I think I always really connect with Kai Lin as a character. I understand her sort of passion for knowledge and the way that she sort of kind of, her cunningness in kind of getting that knowledge, and of course I know where the story goes, but I want you to kind of consider who is your favourite character at the moment and how and why, and then how do you sort of imagine their storyline is going to unfold as the story progresses, and what sort of ideas do you think is going to happen. Now there's other things I want you to think about. When I talked about the roles of the mother, Liu Dan has a very interesting relationship with her mother and more of her mother's legacy. So how do you think that's going to roll out throughout the rest of the story, and what do you think that sort of relationship is going to signify for how Liu Dan navigates through the rest of the relationships with other women in this book? I also find Chiffon is a very interesting character. Now on page 20 there was a quote that said, "It wasn't indenture, quite, but in some ways it was worse," and that sort of describes the relationship Chiffon has with the guard. Now I want you to think about, it's not indenture, it's worse. So what is that worse, and what does that sort of already stamp Siphone's fate, and what kind of can we learn about Siphone's relationship with the guard, and the guard as a sort of mother character? How is that going to shape Siphone's story? What do we think is going to happen there? Do we think it's important, or do we not think it's important? How do you imagine that's going to unravel as the story progresses, particularly as Siphon begins to learn Jinshu and the meaning of Jin-Shei for her? Now, because I have read the whole book, I have noticed a lot of foreshadowing in this first part of the story. So I kind of want to open up questions to you, as people who might be reading this for the first time. What sort of foreshadowing do you think has been noted in the book so far? In this part, is there anything that stands out to you as something that you think is going to be meaningful later on? And how do you think that's going to take shape? It's always really interesting to get these first impressions out there to kind of use as a sort of an anchor for yourself when you're reading the rest of the story, but also as a way of reflecting when you have finished the story, how you thought the story was going to pan out versus how the story actually did pan out. And I always find it fascinating to see those sort of differences and how things might not always go the way we think, but how sometimes we can predict certain things because of how well an author has foreshadowed them in a book. So yes, let me know all of your thoughts about everything I've talked about so far in the comments section down below. I want to hear everything, all of your thoughts and opinions, and do you have any ideas that I haven't talked about in this video which you think are important to this first part of the story? So thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and I can't wait to talk to you again next week, same day, Sunday, and of course Wednesday for live chat on Twitter, about the second part of the book. So, thank you again. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.